In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgment, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon, for the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are often plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and as I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after having boasted this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt like I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some higher sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that registers earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter-raids so thoroughly I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now felt like the ragged edge of the universe, so I decided I would go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently I thought, in the spring of '22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season and I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees, so when a young man at the office suggested we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute the firm ordered him to Washington and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so, until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I felt that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down into the young breath-giving air. About a dozen volumes on banks and credits and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold, like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas, Morgan, and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This is not just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at through a single window, after all. It is a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It is on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contours, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story. Identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere. They are not perfect ovals like the egg in the Columbus story, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual wonder to the gulls flying overhead. To the wingless, a more interesting phenomenon is their complete dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. My house was at the very tip of the egg, squeezed between two huge places. I do this every time. My house is at the very tip of the egg, squeezed between two huge places, and there's gotta be. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two. Although this is a most superficial tag for the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house is at the very tip of the egg, squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard, a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivory, and a marble swimming pool, and over 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore and had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the real history of the summer begins. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, and just after the war I'd spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, was one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money had been a matter for reproach. But now they'd come east, now they'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, they brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines as if from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, open to the warm, windy afternoon, and glowing now with reflected gold and open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. He was now a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a hard mouth and rather supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes couldn't hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and one could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulders moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even towards people he liked, and there had been men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep puncheon roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Jermaine, the oil man. He turned me around again politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside." We walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleamed white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little ways into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew the curtains in at one end and out at the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling. And then rippling over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they'd just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood there for a moment listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rug and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she showed no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came a little forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again as if she'd said something very witty. Then she held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Daisy. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered and she nodded at me almost imperceptibly, then tipped her head quickly back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a bit and given her something of a fright. I looked back at my cousin, who began asking me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have their left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's—" Tom Buchanan, who'd been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested a hand on my shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bond man." "With who?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he answered decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I said shortly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if alert to something more. "I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." At this point, Miss Baker said "absolutely" with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently it surprised her as much as it had me. With a series of rapid, deft movements, she stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been sitting on that sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't blame me," Daisy retorted. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No, thank you," said Miss Baker to the tray of 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are?" He took down his drink as if it were the drop in the bottom of a glass. "How you get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at Miss Baker. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulder like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. And it occurred to me that I'd seen her, or a picture of her, somewhere before. "You live in West Egg," she said contemptuously. I know somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging a tense arm under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as if moving a checker to another square. Slenderly and languidly, their hands set lightly at their sides, the two young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it." "We have to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she said, "I hurt it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom." "You didn't mean to do it, but you did do it." "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "You didn't mean to do it, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big hulking specimen of a—" "I hate that word hulking," objected Tom crossly. "Even in kidding." "Hulking," insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker spoke at once, with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desires. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was rushed, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its end, in a continually disappointed anticipation or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed after my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in a strange way. "Civilization's going to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about everything. Have you read Rise of the Colored Empire by this man Goddard?" "Why, no," I stammered, rather surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is that if we don't watch out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." "Tom's getting very profound," said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them." "What was that word we—" "Well, these books are all scientific," insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. "This fellow's worked the whole thing out. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to look out, or these other races will have control of things." "We've got to beat them down," whispered Daisy, winking ferociously into the fervent sun. "You ought to live in California," began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. "This idea is we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and—" After an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. "And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see?" There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside, and the butler left the table, Daisy leaned forward excitedly. "I'll tell you a family secret. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for a group of people in New York that had a polishing service for over 200 people. He had to polish from morning till night until it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse," suggested Miss Baker. "Yes, things went from bad to worse," continued Daisy, "until he had to give up his position. For a moment the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her face. Last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her face. Her voice compelling me breathlessly forward as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light leaving her face with lingering regret like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back, murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, threw down his napkin, pushed back his chair, and went wordlessly inside. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward to me again. "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose. An absolute rose. Doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. "An absolute rose?" This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart were trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw down her napkin, excused herself, and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I started to speak, but she leaned forward and said shh in a warning tone. A murmur, a subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond. And Miss Baker leaned forward unashamed, trying to hear. Or leaned forward, trying to hear, unashamed. The murmur rose excitedly. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. "This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor," I began. "Quiet," said Miss Baker. "I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" I inquired innocently. I inquired innocently. "You mean you don't know?" she said, honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't." "Why," she hesitated, "Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman," I repeated blankly. She nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?" Almost before I grasped her meaning, there was the crunch of a leather boot. There was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of a leather boot, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "Couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She glanced searchingly at Miss Baker and then at me, and then continued, "I looked outdoors for a minute. It's very romantic outdoors. I saw a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over in the canard of the White Star Line, and he's singing away." Her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I'd like to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, indeed, it's either topic or subject. Indeed, all subjects vanished into air. After dinner, Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while I, trying to seem pleasantly interested and a little deaf, followed Daisy around a series of connecting verandas to the porch in front. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side in a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and gradually her eyes moved out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be sedative questions about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly. "You didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true," she hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time. And I've gotten to be terribly pessimistic about everything. I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I've gotten to be very pessimistic about everything." Evidently she had reason to be. I waited for a minute for her to go on. But she didn't say any more, and so I returned rather feebly to the subject of her little girl. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh yes," she looked at me absently. Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where, and I came out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. I turned to the nurse right away and asked if it was a boy or a girl. It was a girl, she said, and I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so, all the best people, and I know. I've been everywhere and done everything and seen everything. Her eyes flashed about in a defiant way, rather like Tom's. And she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. The moment her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I saw the basic insincerity of what she had said. I waited for a moment, and sure enough, I saw the basic insincerity of what she had said. As if the whole evening had been an elaborate trick to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited for a moment, and sure enough, an absolute grin. She looked at me. She looked at me with an absolute grin, as if she had just asserted her membership into a secret society which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. Inside the crimson room bloomed with light. Miss Baker read aloud. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch. Miss Baker read aloud, and she was reading aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn yellow of her hair, on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned the page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arm. The words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tone. The lamplight bright on her boots, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow over here, glinted along the paper as she turned the page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arm. She held us silent when we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a raised hand. To be continued, she said, in our very next issue. She threw the magazine down on the table. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee. 8 o'clock, she said. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Or 10 o'clock, she said, evidently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, said Daisy, helpfully. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face had been familiar. Its pleasing contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Palm Beach and Hot Springs. Asheville and Palm Beach and Hot Springs. Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I'd read some story of her too, but what it was, a critical, unpleasant story. But what it was, I'd forgotten long ago. But what it had been, I'd forgotten long ago. Wake me up at 8, won't you? If you'll get up, I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, insisted Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you together. Oh, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat, that sort of thing. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. Lovely girl, said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? inquired Daisy coldly. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's gonna take care of her, aren't you, Nick? She's gonna spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed there together, our beautiful white... Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Tom demanded suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't quite remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, it just sort of crept up on us, and first thing we knew. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They followed me to the door and stood in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged. To a girl out west. Yes, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard you were engaged. It's a libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it. Insisted Daisy. But we heard it from 3 people, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up in a flower-like way. So it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons that I had come east. One can't stop going out with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Nevertheless, their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused, and as I drove away, I was confused and a little disgusted. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush from the house, child in arms. But evidently there were no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman was rather less surprising than the fact that he had been depressed by a book. Something was causing him to nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep into summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside gas stations, wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. When I arrived at my estate in West Egg, When I arrived at my West Egg estate, I rolled the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned lawn roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night, with wings beating in the trees and the full bellows of the earth blowing the frogs to life, and a persistent organ sound as the bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. The silhouette of a cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, the shadow of a man had emerged. The shadow of a figure had emerged from my neighbor's mansion, and was standing with his hands in his pockets regarding the silver pepper of the stars. Something in his posture and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction, but I did not call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He thrust his arms out towards the dark water in a curious way, and, far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a small green light which might have been the end of a dock, minute and far away. When I turned back once more, when I looked for Gatsby once more, he had vanished, leaving me alone, and I was alone again in the unquiet night. Chapter 2. About halfway between New York and West Egg, the motor road hastily joins the railroad for a quarter of a mile. The motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile so as to skirt around a desolate area of land. This was the Valley of Ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills. And fantastic farms. Fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills. A grotesque garden where ashes grow into houses and chimneys and rising smoke, and with transcendent effort into ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. Occasionally a gray car crawls along an invisible track, gives out a ghastly groan, and comes to rest, and the ash-gray men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud with screens that obscure operation from your view. But above the bleak gray land, but above the land and the bleak sky with its spasms of dust drifting endlessly over it, one perceives after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high. They look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles that pass over no nose. Evidently, some wild wag of an oculist had set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens, and then had sank down himself into eternal blindness, or had forgotten them and moved away. Sank down into eternal blindness, or forgotten them and moved away. But they stared on, their color dulled by many paintless days under sun and rain. They brood on over the solemn wasteland. And then something about a drawbridge. And the drawbridge is up to let the barges through. Passengers in the waiting trains can stare at the dismal scene for up to half an hour. There's always a pause here of at least a minute, and it is because of this that I met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he would show up at popular cafes with her and, leaving her at a table, saunter about, chatting with whomsoever he knew. I was curious to see her, but I did not want to meet her, but I did. As the train was stopped, Tom leapt to his feet and, grabbing me by the elbow, literally forced me from the car. "Come on," he said, "I want you to meet my girl." I think he tanked up a good bit at lunch. I think he tanked up a good bit at luncheon, and his desire for my company, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. We walked back along we got off the car, and walked back along the road for a quarter of a mile. They climb over a fence, climb over a whitewashed railroad fence, and walked back along the road for a quarter of a mile under Dr. Eckelberg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight was a small square of yellow brick on the edge of the wasteland. Was a small square yellow brick on the edge of the wasteland ministering to it, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One shop was for rent and another was an all-night restaurant with a trail of ashes leading to it, and the third said, "Repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold." The inside was unprosperous and bare. The only car visible was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford that crouched dimly in a corner, or crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and that sumptuous and romantic apartments were concealed overhead. Then the proprietor himself appeared in a doorway, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. His eyes, a damp gleam of hope, sprang into his... He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. A damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eye. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang into his light blue eyes. "How you doing, Wilson, old man?" said Tom jovially, slapping him on the shoulder. "Can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I ought to sell it somewhere else instead after all." "I didn't mean it like that." Wilson's voice trailed off, and Tom was glancing impatiently around the garage. And suddenly, the thick figure of a woman appeared in the doorway. I think that's all I got.